We're living in a very interesting time. The civilization that we call Western techno-industrial civilization is simultaneously becoming global and collapsing. As far as we know, historically, that's never happened before on this planet. I mean, civilizations have collapsed before. Rome collapsed. It collapsed from inside. Why? Because it depleted the granaries, the North African granaries. You have no bread to feed the soldiers. Forget it. The military, your military won't fight if they don't get fed. They didn't think about that, you see. The military, the empire always wants to expand, right? It's just like now. Just expand. We can do it. We've got the greatest military in the world. Well, it's not going to do you any good, you see. If you can't feed the soldiers, if you can't pay for it. There's elements within the culture that want to keep things the same. That's true of the economy and politics too, you see. People who have power want to keep power. People who have wealth want to keep the wealth. That's the primary motivation. Capitalism, what's called the neoliberal model, is a dysfunctional system. It's not life sustainable. It doesn't support all of life. And half the population on the planet is living at a poverty level. 1 billion people who are permanently hungry. Tens of thousands of families who live full-time on a trash dump in Manila or Mexico City. You can't by any stretch of the imagination call that a civilization. The ecosystems on the entire planet are being stressed and overstressed to the maximum of their carrying capacity. Population is increasing exponentially, so vastly increasing demand on ever decreasing resources. It's a runaway system. The modern worldview is being replaced by, some people call it a postmodern, but I think it's ridiculous. You can say it's a systems worldview. And the modern worldview is mechanistic and atomistic and linear causality and quantitative, and the only real realm is the realm of measurable objects and forces. Everything else, that means images in your mind, thoughts, intuitions, imaginations, symbols, anything that, dreams, anything that is merely subjective. Values is merely subjective. Values are not objective. Therefore, we can have a science that can make bombs and obliterate thousands, all this kind of thing, and devastate the atmosphere. And we can say, well, we're scientists, we don't deal with values, that's politics, you see, and economics.
Our crisis is a birth. It's a birth of this new humanity that's been prefigured in the mystics, but now going to be pressured by the crises. It took all of those years for the crisis to mature.
Shamanism is extremely important for several reasons. One is that it's one of the best ways to give the dominant culture a way of seeing that the natural world and human nature are not so encased as the current paradigm would suggest. Amazing things happen and even can be made to happen. There are other dimensions, there are other beings, other ways of knowing, other ways of experiencing, and there are rules and procedures which make this happen.
It's interesting that they use two metaphors for shamans or descriptions. One, they call them trackers. That's like also called soul retrieval, or it's like psychotherapy, or like diagnosis of an illness, you see. The other metaphor they use is spirit lawyer. They say problems arise in a family, or what we would call psychological problems, and sometimes physical illnesses, because we've offended their spirits in some way, or we've failed to acknowledge them properly. And the shaman being the one who knows the spirit world and how to access it, and who knows the songs and the names of the spirits. That's like having the access code, in computer language, or the telephone number, how to get hold of these people, these beings. They're spirits of the environment, like the waterfall or the forest or the river, and so we don't do that. If we went to a shaman and he might say, well, your problems come from the pollution in the river. You guys need to clean up the river. How can you expect to be healthy? Our worldview in terms of healing involves when you're ill, you go to the doctor, and the doctor gives you a pill or does a surgery, and then take something out or put something in to your system. So supposing you live in a South American community and you feel out of sorts, you go to the shaman. He or she might take ayahuasca before he gives you anything, in order to see what is the origin of the illness by using expanded perception. Then he's likely to express that in symbolic languages. He might talk about the serpent, or wouldn't necessarily say viruses or anything like that. And he might talk, very often he'll talk about sorcery. If somebody has negative intention to you and sent you a little dart. Now we think that's ridiculous, no, sorcery doesn't exist. But what it is it's a recognition of the power of thought. So every time you think a thought, you're affecting the consciousness of everyone who comes into contact with that thought, including the collective. So every time we think a thought, for example, that's why programming in the media is such a phenomenally impactful. Of course, we participate in it and we feed that system and we're fed by it. And just think of the multiplication of thought forms and images that stimulate you to buy stuff, and that's the salvation of happiness. And entrainment means that all the rhythms come to be harmonic to each other, not necessarily the same beat, but harmonic to each other. And then if numerous people doing it at the same time, you have the beats of the different people, the rhythms of the different people being harmonic with each other, as well as like you would have in choral chanting, and they're harmonic. They're not singing the same note. That's not the point. But they're harmonic and therefore resonant with one another, so it would produce tremendous feelings of oneness and bonding among people, regardless of the content. See, they may be thinking different thoughts and having different pictures going on in the mind. That's the basic idea. What's the DJ doing, or the musicians? You know, they're driving. They're like the conductor, basically, of the whole theme. So just like a symphony orchestra has a conductor, make sure everybody's on the same page and playing the same time and tempo and so on. The difference between the dance, like a rave, is that there's not the musicians, the performers, and the audience. This basic drum beat is the basic method when you do a shamanic journey without drugs. There's a certain beat you use to travel on, and then there's a signal that you get that means stop, and then there's a fast beat that means come back to your starting point. Because that's the whole point. You want to come back to your starting point. It's always an going in, really, and then a return journey with the knowledge or the information that you obtained. But it was interesting to me to see that when you look at cross-culturally, the studies of the mushroom shamans in Mexico, or the Native American church, or the ayahuasca churches in Brazil, they use singing, but it's always rhythmic singing. You listen to Maria Sabina do her chants, and it's like the ayahuasca thing is the same. The peyote one too, a little faster sometimes. What does that do? That means you keep going. You see, it encourages you to keep going, and therefore counteracts the tendency you might have to get hung up, either distracted or seduced by something, or terrified or paralyzed by something. You just keep going. Through entrainment, that would be similar to when you're choral singing and chanting together. In addition, the rhythm, I think, has another function in terms of shamanic journeys, divination journeys, in the sense that, and this is why in the European cultures, you see, they say, the shamanic cultures, they say the drum beat is the horse. And it's the vehicle. And when you're listening to the drum beat, it furthers your concentration. You have something to concentrate on. It's like as soon as you hear the drum, then you'll be reminded of what that purpose is. And you're reminded of what you're doing. Oh yes, I'm on it. Let me get back to what I'm doing.
To look at the history of these West African possession religions as they come over to the Americas in the slave trade, and of course they are not allowed to practice these religions in the form with which they are accustomed. So for example, in the United States the drum was outlawed. The only place in the United States where the drum wasn't outlawed was New Orleans.
People in a drumming circle or in a ecstatic dance setting can connecting themselves with the continuous legacy of the incarnation of vitality in the form of Homo sapiens.
Oral skill in African American culture, and you can trace it all the way back to West Africa, the griot or the Jolly tradition, where these were sort of court poets who had a sacred function and memorized these long poems of, you know, thousands or tens of thousands of words and so forth. And it goes through, you know, various street lingo in African American culture, and, you know, you can even see it in people like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. or Muhammad Ali, or where there's this kind of function of sacred language. And this is where the word flow comes in, because essentially they're improvising, and they're just, and so there's a certain level that you get to where your conscious mind just sort of steps out of the way and the words just flow.
We have, I think, for the last 40,000 years, since self-consciousness had been developing individuality. And maybe the whole development of ego is necessary in order for us to become individuals who are not embedded in nature and just purely children of God. So out of that, we have individuated right up to the edge of individualization destroying us. Now, the way we become multicellular, the way we join together, is first of all by individuals feeling the need to find that divine self within, because you can't really join as an ego with ego.